The dust tasted of malice. It was a fine, pale grit that settled on everything, a shroud for the living and the dead. She felt it on her lips, in the dry bed of her throat, a constant reminder of the town's indifference. Her wrists were raw where the rope bit into her skin, looped around the weathered hitching post in the center of what passed for a square. The sun was a hammer, beating down on her bowed head, bleaching the life from the splintered planks of the boardwalks and the false fronts of the buildings. Her dress, a thing of faded calico and 100 careful patches, was frayed at the hem, dark with stains she no longer remembered acquiring. Her feet were bare against the hot, packed earth. She did not look up. The sky was too big, too empty. The faces of the crowd were worse. She focused on a dark knot in the wood of the post, a whirl like a blind eye staring back at her. It was a small, solid thing in a world that had dissolved into whispers and heat. A man named Callum had put her here. He stood now on the steps of the mercantile, arms crossed over his chest, his face a mask of sour pride. He had owned her contract, a piece of paper that said she was his to work until his debt was cleared. But the work was done, the debt paid by another's hand, and he found himself with a woman he had no more use for. She was, he declared to the gathered men, damaged goods. Too quiet, thin as a fence rail, carried a sadness that soured the milk. The crowd murmured. A few laughed, a sharp, ugly sound that bounced off the silent buildings. A woman in a severe bonnet shook her head, a flicker of pity that was almost worse than the scorn. Most were simply spectators to a small, mean piece of theater. They were waiting to see what would happen to a thing no one wanted. She felt their eyes on her like stones, heavy and bruising. She learned long ago that if you held yourself still enough, if you made yourself small enough, sometimes the world forgot you were there. She clung to that stillness now like it was a prayer. From the shadowed alley between the smithy and the saloon, a man watched. He had been there for the better part of an hour, a ghost leaning against the brickwork, his presence as unassuming as a stack of old crates. His name was Elias, and he carried whole winters in his eyes. The dust of the long trail settled in the creases of his worn duster, a map of lonely places. He had come to town for salt and flour, a brief and necessary intrusion into a silence he had cultivated for 5 years. He had not come for this. He watched Callum posture and spit, his voice loud with the righteousness of a man discarding a broken tool. He watched the woman, how she didn't flinch, didn't cry out. She simply endured, her stillness a fortress. He saw the fine tremor in her shoulders, the only betrayal of the terror that must be living inside her. He knew that kind of stillness. He had lived inside it himself, in the hollowed-out years after he'd buried his Sarah on the hill behind his cabin. He saw the way the other men looked at her, some with a flicker of coarse appetite, most with the casual cruelty of the comfortable. They saw an object, problem, piece of bad luck. Elias saw the taut line of her jaw, the strength it took to hold her head at that angle, not quite bowed in defeat, but not raised in defiance either. It was the posture of survival. Callum grew tired of his audience. Anyone want her for a week's mending? $1 buys her contract. His voice was laced with contempt. Silence answered. The wind picked up, skittering a piece of paper across the square. The sun beat down. Elias pushed himself off the wall. The movement was slow, deliberate. He walked out of the shadows and into the stark, unforgiving light. His boots made no sound in the thick dust. He didn't look at the crowd. His eyes were fixed on Callum. He stopped a few feet away. He was not a large man, but there was a density to him, a weight that came from solitude and sorrow. He reached into his coat, his hand emerging not with a weapon, but with a small, worn leather pouch. He untied the drawstring and tipped $2 silver into his palm. They shone with a dull, honest light. "I'll take her," he said. His voice was low, rough from disuse, like it came from under floorboards. Callum blinked, surprised. He looked Elias up and down, taking in the worn clothes, the tired face. A sneer touched his lips. "She ain't worth $2, friend. She ain't worth the air she breathes." Elias didn't argue. He didn't offer a reason. He simply held out the coins. The silence stretched, thick and heavy. The crowd watched, their curiosity piqued. This was a new turn in the play. Elias's gaze was steady, unblinking. It was not a request. Callum hesitated, then shrugged, a gesture of manufactured indifference. He snatched the coins from Elias's palm. The transaction was complete. It was as simple and as brutal as that. Elias turned his back on Callum. He walked to the post. The woman did not look up, not even when his shadow fell over her. He could see the pale, fragile skin of her neck, the way a few strands of sun-bleached hair clung to it like wet paper. He pulled a small, sharp knife from his belt. The blade was clean, well cared for. For a moment, she flinched, a barely perceptible tightening of her entire body. He saw it. He paused, holding the knife still. He didn't speak. He simply waited until the tremor passed. Then, with a single, clean motion, he sawed through the thick rope. It fell away from her wrists in two limp pieces. She remained kneeling for a long moment, her hands resting in her lap as if she'd forgotten they were free. He stepped back, giving her space. He sheathed his knife and waited. He did not offer a hand. He did not offer a word of comfort. He offered her the dignity of rising on her own. Slowly, stiffly, she pushed herself to her feet. Her legs trembled from having been bound for so long. She finally lifted her head, and for the first time her eyes met his. They were the color of a winter sky, filled with a caution so deep it looked like emptiness. She said nothing. Her gaze was a question without words. He gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod toward the edge of town, toward the open, unforgiving land that stretched away to the hazy line of the mountains. Then he turned and began to walk. He did not look back to see if she was following. He knew she would. There was nowhere else for her to go. The journey was a long, silent procession of two. The dust lifted behind them like ghosts of the people they had been. He set a slow, steady pace, mindful of her bare feet on the sharp, sun-baked earth. The sun slid down the sky, painting the western horizon in brutal strokes of blood orange and bruised purple. The air began to cool. After an hour, he stopped. He unslung his canteen and held it out to her. She watched him for a long moment, her eyes narrowed with a suspicion that was old and deeply ingrained. Then she took it. Her fingers were cold as they brushed against his. She drank, a few sparing, careful sips, before handing it back. It was the first kindness. It was the first exchange that was not a transaction. They did not speak. The silence wasn't empty. It was a waiting thing, an open space between them. The landscape itself seemed to be holding its breath. The wind whispered through the sagebrush, a lonely, mournful sound. He walked and she followed, a step or two behind, a shadow he had pulled from the sun-scorched square. It was full dark when they arrived. The cabin was a dark shape against a spill of stars, small and defiant in the vast emptiness. A low stone wall enclosed a small yard, and beyond it, a barn leaned into the wind. On a small rise to the east, a single wooden marker stood stark against the sky. The place felt steeped in a quiet ache. It was a home built for two, now inhabited by one. Elias pushed open the door. It swung inward with a low groan. The air inside was cool and smelled of wood smoke, dust, and something else. A faint, lingering scent of dried lavender, a memory trapped in the wood. He moved with the easy familiarity of a man who knew every board and shadow. He lit a lantern on the rough-hewn table, and the small room bloomed with a soft, yellow light. It was a simple place. A stone hearth, a table with two chairs, a bed built into one wall. Everything was clean, but worn, a testament to use to a life lived. He gestured to a small, curtained-off alcove. Inside was a narrow cot with a neatly folded blanket. "That's yours," he said. The words felt loud in the quiet room. She looked at the cot, then back at him. Her face was unreadable in the flickering light. He saw that she was looking at the main door at the simple wooden latch. "I don't lock doors," he said, answering the unspoken question. He turned away, busying himself at the hearth, coaxing a few embers back to life. He added small pieces of kindling, his movements economical and sure. He did not want her to feel like a prisoner. He wanted her to understand that the ropes were truly gone. This was the unspoken contract. He would provide shelter, she would have her space. Safety was a room of one's own, and a door left unlocked. He set a pot of water over the growing flames. He took down 2 tin plates, 2 cups. He moved around the small space as if she were not there, a deliberate performance of normalcy. He was giving her time to let the silence of the cabin soak in, to let its peace begin to work against the noise of the town. He sliced bread from a hard loaf and set it on the table with a piece of cheese. He did not invite her to eat. He simply put the food where she could reach it. She remained by the alcove, a statue carved from weariness. Finally, after the fire was crackling and the water was steaming in the pot, she moved. She sat down at the table, in the chair opposite his, and pulled a plate toward her. Her hands trembled slightly as she took a piece of bread. They ate in silence, the only sounds the crackle of the fire and the whisper of the wind outside the cabin walls. The days settled into a rhythm as stark and simple as the landscape. Elias would rise before the sun, his movements quiet, and be gone to the barn or the fields before she stirred. He would leave coffee on the hearth and a piece of bread on the table. When she woke, the cabin would be empty, filled only with the pale morning light. At first, she did little. She stayed in her alcove, a small, still creature in the shadows. She watched him from the single window as he mended a fence, his back a strong, steady line against the horizon. She watched him chop wood, the rhythmic thud of the axe a kind of heartbeat for the homestead. He never looked toward the window. He gave her the gift of being unobserved. Then slowly a change began. It started with the floor. One morning, he returned at midday to find that she had swept it clean with a worn-out broom. The dust of his lonely years was gone, replaced by the scent of damp earth where she had sprinkled a little water. He said nothing. He simply nodded as he took his seat at the table, and for the first time, she did not retreat to her cot but sat opposite him while he ate. The next day, she washed their plates in a basin of hot water. The day after that, she took his torn work shirt from a peg by the door and, using a needle and thread she found in a small wooden box, began to mend it. Her stitches were small and neat, a line of careful repairs on the frayed fabric. They were stitching their lives together with raw thread, though neither of them would have given it that name. One afternoon, she wandered outside. The air was sharp, carrying the first hint of autumn. She walked past the barn and up the small rise to the single grave. The wooden marker was weathered, the name carved into it almost erased by sun and snow. Sarah. She knelt and began to pull the weeds that had grown thick around its base. Her fingers, deft and sure, cleared the space until the earth was dark and clean. She found a single, stubborn wildflower, a splash of defiant yellow, growing near the fence line, and placed it at the foot of the marker. Elias saw her from the field. He stopped his work, his hands resting on the worn handles of the plow. He watched her small, solitary act of kindness, an offering to a ghost she had never known. Something in his chest, a thing he had thought long dead and buried, shifted. It was a feeling so unfamiliar he didn't have a name for it. When he came in for supper that evening, he found a bowl of stew, thin but hot, waiting for him. He ate every bite. "It's good," he said, his voice gruff. She looked down at her hands. A faint flush touched her cheeks. It was the first time he had seen color in her face. He left a thick wool shawl on her cot the next morning. The nights were growing colder. She left a newly baked loaf of bread on the table. It was heavy and a little burned on the bottom. He broke off a piece. "A little dry," he said, his mouth almost twitching into a smile. She looked up, a spark of something, defiance, maybe, in her eyes. "You didn't complain about mine." It was the longest sentence she had spoken. The air in the cabin held the echo of it. He looked at her, and she looked back, and for a moment, the space between them was not filled with silence or sorrow, but with the fragile beginning of something else. The first snow came early that year, a soft, white blanket that muffled the world and made the cabin feel like the only solid place on earth. The nights were long and cold, the days short and sharp. They spent more time inside, sharing the small space and the warmth of the fire. The silence between them was different now. It was comfortable, a shared language. One night, a blizzard descended, a howling fury of wind and snow that shook the cabin's sturdy frame. The wind turned mean, clawing at the door and rattling the window pane. She sat by the fire, mending one of his socks, her face serene in the flickering light. Elias watched her, the needle moving in and out, a small, rhythmic motion of repair. A particularly violent gust of wind slammed against the cabin, and she jumped, the sock falling from her hands. Her face went pale, her eyes wide with a fear that was old and deep. "Don't," she whispered. The word so soft he almost didn't hear it over the storm. "Don't lock me in." He got up from his chair and crossed to her. He knelt so he was at her level. "I told you," he said, his voice low and steady. "I don't lock doors." Tears welled in her eyes, silver tracks in the firelight. He did. Every night. A dark root cellar. The sound of the bolts sliding shut. She trailed off, her body trembling. It was the first piece of her past she had offered him, a shard of broken glass. He didn't touch her. He didn't offer empty platitudes. He simply knelt there, a solid presence in the storm, and met her fear with his own quiet strength. He stayed there until the trembling subsided, until her breathing evened out. "Why?" she asked finally, the same question she had asked with her eyes on the day he'd cut her free. "Why did you take me?" He looked into the fire, at the flames that danced and consumed. "My Sarah," he began, the name tasting strange on his tongue after so many years of silence. "She was a kind woman. She would not have left you there. This place," he looked around the small, warm room, "it was empty for too long. A house needs a kindness in it to be a home." He looked back at her. "I couldn't leave you there." She held his gaze, and in that moment, the unspoken contract was rewritten. It was no longer about shelter and safety. It was about something more. It was about two broken people finding a way to piece together a life from the fragments of what they had lost. The fire only changes everything if something new is waiting in the ash. The peace of their winter sanctuary was shattered by the sight of 3 riders on the horizon. They were not the slow, meandering shapes of lost cattlemen. They moved with a grim purpose, their forms dark against the endless white of the snow. Elias saw them from the barn. He straightened up, his hand going instinctively to the handle of the axe leaning against the wall. A cold knot formed in his gut. The past had a long memory and a cruel way of finding you. He went back to the cabin. She was humming a tune, a low, nameless melody, as she kneaded dough on the table. The air was warm and smelled of yeast and wood smoke. Smelled like a home. He hated the thought of the world intruding on it. "There are riders coming," he said. The humming stopped. Her hands stilled in the dough. She looked at him, and he saw the old fear flicker in her eyes, the ghost of the hitching post. But then it was gone, replaced by a new, hard resolve he had never seen before. She wiped her hands on her apron and looked toward the door, her chin lifted. It was Callum. Of course it was Callum. He reined in his horse just outside the low stone wall, his 2 hired men flanking him. He looked fatter, softer than Elias remembered, his face ruddy with cold and arrogance. His gaze swept over the homestead, a look of contemptuous appraisal. Then his eyes landed on her as she stood in the doorway, just behind Elias. "Well, well," Callum called out, his voice thin in the vast, cold air. "Look what the hermit dragged home. I heard you'd worked a miracle. Cleaned her up right nice," he smiled. "A greasy, unpleasant thing. I've come to collect my property. Turns out I have a use for her after all." Elias didn't move. He stood on his own land, a quiet, immovable object. His worn duster was dusted with snow. He looked as much a part of the winter landscape as the frozen trees. She's not your property, he said, his voice flat and cold as river ice. I have a contract, Callum sneered, patting a pocket in his coat. Says she's mine. You paid $2 for a loan, not a purchase. The town will back me on this. The town's not here, Elias said, and you're not welcome on this land. He had turned his home into a fortress, a sanctuary. This was the battleground. Callum's face darkened. He gestured to one of his men. Go get her. The man hesitated, looking from Callum's angry face to Elias's still, dangerous calm. Elias hadn't moved a muscle, but the threat was there, coiled and waiting. He was a man with nothing left to lose, and that made him more dangerous than any paid thug. But before the man could move, something shifted. She stepped out from behind Elias. She was no longer the silent, broken thing from the town square. The winter had put a little flesh on her bones, and the quiet dignity of her life here had straightened her spine. Her eyes, once vacant, were now clear and fierce. In her hand, she held the heavy iron poker from the hearth. She didn't raise it like a weapon. She just held it, its weight a solid, tangible fact. She looked directly at Callum, her gaze unwavering. No, she said. The word was not loud. It was not a plea or a shout. It was a statement, a boundary line drawn in the snow, the end of a story and the beginning of a new one. It was the voice of a woman who had found her name, even if she hadn't spoken it aloud yet. Callum stared, genuinely shocked. He had come expecting to reclaim an object. He was being defied by a person. The calculus of the situation changed entirely. His bluster faltered. He looked at Elias's unyielding stance, at the woman with the iron poker and the fire in her eyes, and he saw not a hermit and his ward, but a unified front. He saw a family, forged in silence and snow. His men shifted uncomfortably on their horses. This wasn't the easy work they'd been promised. There was a kind of moral authority here that their guns and their paid loyalty couldn't breach. This isn't over, Callum spat, but the threat was hollow. He was a man of contracts and public opinion, not of cold steel and conviction. He had lost. He yanked on his reins, turning his horse with a violent jerk, and rode away, his men trailing behind him like dogs. Their dark shapes grew smaller and smaller until the white, indifferent landscape swallowed them whole. The threat was gone. The silence that descended was profound. It was the silence of victory, of a storm that has finally passed. She looked at the iron poker in her hand as if surprised to find it there, and let it drop into the snow. Her shoulders slumped, the adrenaline leaving her in a sudden wave. Elias turned to her. He saw the tremor in her hands, the exhaustion that lined her face. He reached out not to comfort, but to steady, his rough, calloused fingers closing gently over her arm. You didn't run, he said, his voice full of a quiet wonder. She looked up at him, a faint, weary smile touching her lips. Neither did you. They went back inside, into the warmth of the cabin. The scent of bread and safety enveloped them. He bolted the door, not against her, but with her against the world. They stood by the fire, a shared look passing between them, an affirmation deeper than any words. In the quiet of the cabin, with the snow falling softly outside, they were no longer two separate, broken people. They were one. The winter thawed, and the land came back to life with a fierce, fragile green. The confrontation with Callum had changed everything. It had burned away the last of the fear, the last of the old identities. When the preacher made his spring circuit, riding through the valley, Elias met him on the road. They were married on the porch of the cabin, the two of them and the preacher and the wide, open sky. It was not a ceremony of passion, but of quiet declaration. It was a formalizing of the fact that already existed. They were a unit, family. When the preacher asked for her name for the record, she hesitated for only a second. Lena, she said. It was a name she had chosen for herself, a name that belonged to this new life, to this new person who had stood in the snow and said no. Elias spoke the name for the first time. Lena, it felt right, felt like coming home. They marked the day not with celebration, but with a simple, symbolic act. Together, they gathered the ragged, patched dress she had worn when she arrived, the last physical remnant of the woman at the hitching post. They built a small, clean fire in the yard and laid the dress upon it. They watched as the flames consumed the frayed calico, turning the fabric of her past into gray, weightless ash that the wind carried away. Life settled into a new rhythm, one of peace and quiet purpose. The silence in the cabin was no longer a space of waiting or healing, but of contentment. It was filled with the small sounds of a shared life, the scrape of a chair, the soft thump of bread being kneaded, the low murmur of two voices by the firelight as the evening closed in. The house, once hollow and haunted, now breathed. It was full. One evening, they sat on the porch as dusk settled over the valley, painting the hills in soft shades of gray and lavender. The air was cool and smelled of damp earth and pine. Elias was whittling a piece of wood, the shavings falling at his feet. Lena was shelling peas into a bowl in her lap, the pods making a soft snapping sound. They didn't need to speak. The quiet was a blanket they shared. He looked over at her, at the peaceful concentration on her face, at the way the last light of the day caught in her hair. He thought of the woman at the post, the ghost in the dust. And he looked at the woman beside him now, Lena, his wife, his home. He had not gone looking for redemption. He had not intended to save anyone. He had simply offered a small kindness, and in doing so had saved himself. The land was no longer empty. The winters in his eyes had finally begun to thaw. This story, it ain't just about a rescue on a dusty street. It's about the quiet courage it takes to accept a kindness when you've only ever known cruelty. It's about understanding that sometimes, the strongest thing a person can do is mend a shirt, or pull a weed from a stranger's grave. It's about the slow, patient work of building a home inside the walls of another person's heart. It's about being named, not by the world that wants to label you as broken, or used, or worthless, but by the one person who sees you, the one who hands you a new name, or gives you the quiet space to find your own, and in the saying of it, declares you whole. So here's your naming. It's the moment you decide who you are, not who you were. It's the quiet choice, made in a cold cabin or on a windswept hill, to be more than your sorrow. And maybe, if you're brave enough to offer a kindness without expectation, if you're strong enough to accept one without suspicion, you might just find that the loneliest, most desolate places are where the most resilient things grow. You might find that you haven't just built a shelter. You've found a reason to come in from the cold.